George Stephanopoulos is a well-known US journalist for US channel ABC, as well as a former Democratic Party advisor. Far less well-known, perhaps until now anyway, is his sister, Mother Agapia Stephanopoulos, who is an Orthodox Christian nun who has spent much of her adult life in the Palestinian town of Bethany in the occupied West Bank. She recently sat down with Tucker Carlson to talk about the impact of Christian Zionism on Palestine. That's the belief held by some evangelical Christians that Jews must return to the Holy Land to trigger the second coming of Christ. That, by the way, is an apocalyptic event for almost everyone, including Jewish people, with only reborn Christians destined to survive. It was pretty well summed up by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham.
Israel is our friend. They're the most reliable friend we have in the Mideast. They're a democracy, surrounded by people who would cut their throats if they could. This is not a hard choice if you're an American. It's not a hard choice if you're a Christian. A word of warning: if America pulls the plug on Israel, God will pull the plug on us.
I mean, that is just radical religious theocracy in the most blatant form. But what I will say is that when Lindsey Graham says, if the US pulls the plug on Israel, God will pull the plug on the US, he's not entirely wrong. And I don't mean that in the kind of theological sense, let's put that to one side. But in the material sense, in the geopolitical sense, he's not entirely wrong. I think sometimes there is a misconception that the reason that there is this really deep relationship between Israel and the US is because Israel has a really effective lobby. And it does, and that does play a really important role in securing that relationship. But also there is something quite organic about that relationship in the sense that the geopolitical interests of the US and Israel are genuinely shared. I mean, when you think about like the Middle East and North Africa region, this is an inherently important and strategic region for any global power. Firstly, because obviously it's oil resources, it's oil reserves, oil being, the fuel of the modern world, but also because it exists at this interface between Europe, Africa, and Asia. So anyone who wants to be a global superpower has got to have control over that interface because, you have these essential waterways. We all saw when the Suez Canal was blocked for a very short period of time, I mean, billions were lost in global capital. And so it is essential if a country like the US wants to exist in its current form, i.e. as a global superpower, as a hegemon, as a colonial superpower, it has to have that region on lock. That region cannot have sovereignty, because if it has sovereignty, it puts the entire model of the superpower at risk. It puts the geopolitical interest and the ability of that superpower to exist at risk. And so whether it's called Israel, whether it's called something else, the US has to have some kind of ability to hold power in that region. And at the moment, that looks like Israel. And all this stuff around, the Bible, whether it's, what the Bible says, or whether it's, genuine concern for, the presence of a Jewish homeland, all of that is just window dressing for the fact that there is a geopolitical shared interest between the state of Israel and the US. And I mean, I can't remember who said it. I think it might have been Joe Biden. But he said, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create an Israel. And I think that's probably the most honest thing I've ever heard come out of a US president's mouth. Now, back to the interview at hand. Mother Agapia, who taught at a Christian school in the West Bank, began by describing her life as a Christian in Palestine.
The school I was at has 350 girls. It's in a town that's 98% Muslim. Though it has roots, I mean, it's the roots of where Bethany, where on our school grounds is a stone from the 6th century. This is where Christ met Martha at the resurrection. So we're talking about, and it's the road leading, there's still part of the road that existed when Christ walked during that time and would have seen Lazarus and Martha and Mary. Lazarus's tomb is down the road, right? And so permeated even with Palestinian Muslim culture is the sense that Christians lived here and they recognize Jesus as a prophet. So they respect him and so I'm not saying that everything is perfect. You can't have divisions between, just like even with Christians. Some Christians might think we should have allow politics to be in the church or legislate Christian morality. And others would think totally different. So you can have sort of differences of opinion, if you will, and we can all live with each other between that. So with Muslim and Christian, they can have their differences. But overall, the Palestinian culture is infused with both there.
So you were a nun in a majority Muslim town, a Christian nun,
yep,
in your habit, I assume.
And which also was to an advantage because pious Muslims are not jihadists, the ones that I know. I'm not saying other parts of the world that may be the case, but in Palestine, it's simply not the case, or Syria or Lebanon or Iraq. The Muslims there, for the most part, are, they've all grown up together, the Christians and the Muslims, and there's a certain amount of commonality and respect.
Mother Agapia also talked about the treatment of Christians in Palestine by Israel.
They are not imperiled by Muslims in Palestine. That is an absolute fact. And that's just simply not the case. And again, going back to my school, in our school, we had icons, which are part of the Orthodox tradition, pictures of saints and crosses in every classroom. No problem with that. I could show you a photograph, I can't now, but of the graduates of the latest high school graduation. And, they're embracing the nuns there. They're dressed actually in a more secular way. And it all
So a lot of
together.
your students were Muslim?
98%. The only Christian
of your students were Muslims?
Yeah. And about half the teachers during the time I was there have some Muslim, some Christian.
In a Christian school?
Yes. And actually that's all throughout Palestine. The Orthodox is relatively small. We do have schools in many of the Palestinian towns, but also Catholic schools, Lutheran schools. And most of the population, most of the students are Muslims.
Huh.
And the beautiful thing about where the great danger is, if the Christians continue to diminish, a key part of Palestinian society and within Israel as well. You go to Nazareth, you'll see many Catholic-run hospitals, schools. And so it's a fabric, it's a part of the whole character.
But I'm just still confused by the idea that the Christian population is declining under Israeli rule.
Yeah.
You would think just the opposite.
What gives them what I observed from my time in Israel and going back every year is that they do not want any Palestinians there. So the majority of Christians in Israel and Palestine are Palestinian. So they have to leave too.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning there that there is not the difference in treatment of Christians in Palestine versus Israel is not due to kind of like the inherent greatness of one religion over another. It's because it's actually nothing to do with religion. It's because one of those societies is a supremacist society, Israel, and the other one is not. Palestine is not a supremacist society. It never has been. It's always been a multifaceted society, whereas Israel is founded upon a supremacist belief. And so you can't then be surprised that supremacist ideology turns against people that aren't just people that you secretly believe should be discriminated against anyway, i.e. Muslims. So it's, that, and as someone who, is of an Arab Christian background, what I will say is that when I speak to my relatives, my older relatives in particular, they always say that the divisions began within, in Egypt, in my case, the religious hostilities amongst society began when the country neoliberalized, when the country became tethered to US imperialism, because it is imperialism does not survive without divide and rule. But actually prior to that, it just was simply not fractured and hostile in the way that it might be now. Although I would say it's not nearly as bad as it is presented in the media. But Carlson did go on to ask Mother Agapia why the US allowed Israeli persecution of Christians to continue in Palestine.
So we assume that Christians would be getting an exemption from all this. Why would Christians who are not responsible for Christian terror, there's no such thing, why would they be penalized for this? Why wouldn't they, again, when the patron saint state is majority Christian, why wouldn't the Christians there be getting some kind of special pass? I just don't understand that. Why punish the Christians for Islamic terror?
Because I don't think it's Islamic terror that's taking place in the first place. I think we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion that this is a battle between Muslim and Jew, or that, constantly you heard after the October event was that Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Even to this day, we hear it's Hamas,
Yes.
Hamas, Hamas. What is Hamas? Hamas are people who have had their homes taken from them, who, if they live in Gaza, have not been basically been in an open air prison for certainly the last 20 years going on. Even when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they didn't leave open borders. There was no freedom for people in Gaza to develop their economy. If I know people who wanted to try to go to school in America and couldn't get out of Gaza, had a Fulbright scholarship and weren't able to leave.
I mean, couldn't get out.
Israel didn't give them permission. So what kind of freedom is that if you live in Gaza?
They couldn't even fly out?
No. And their airport had been bombed in 2000 and early on. 2000, there was an airport built soon after the Oslo Accords. But Israel has intervened many times in Gaza and little by little destroyed. When I first went there in 2002, after the Second Intifada started, I remember saying to my mother back home, this is genocide, even that genocide by Chinese water torture. But now we're seeing genocide on steroids.
Despite that record persecution of Arab Christians in Palestine, American churches send millions of dollars to Israel each year. This was Mother Agapia explaining why.
The ones that send money that support the settlements are obviously the Christian Zionists. There's an organization called Christians United for Israel, Pastor John Hagee. I was in Washington a few weeks ago because, they had a conference in Baltimore. So it's slowly growing an awareness by other Christians in America that just like many Jews are protesting and saying not in our name, and the Jewish Voice for Peace, there has to be much more done by the Christians in America because these Christian Zionists are speaking in our name. Someone like Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz, is saying and doing what he's doing because he's following a Christianity that is not the Christianity of the Holy Land. It's not the Christianity of a Catholic or an Orthodox or a traditional Christian. It's a heretical belief.
What is Christian Zionism?
Mm-hmm. As far as I understand it, they believe in the idea of the rapture. They believe that it's sort of this cruel bargain they have going with Israel, because basically what they say that they're going to be swooped up into heaven, right? And then there's going to be 1,000-year kingdom. And then there'll be the end of the world and the judgment by Christ, and he'll come back. This is a false, it was condemned as a heresy in 381, because basically there is no 1,000-year millennium to come, no 1,000-year period. The end we are in that time period now. And so it's a false belief there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point in that, to bring up the role of Christian Zionism in this entire conversation, because I was certainly surprised to find out that the biggest pro-Israel lobby in the US is not AIPAC, which is largely Jewish-led, but is actually United Christians for Israel. That is actually the biggest lobby, pro-Israel lobby in the US. And as Mother Stephanopoulos outlined there, churches in the US have been really responsible for a lot of the financial flows, not state-to-state financial flows, but kind of more, let's say, grassroots, I guess, financial flows from the US to Israel, particularly also to those illegal Israeli settlements. I mean, Misha, I wanted to ask you about how not just Christian Zionism, but also the ways in which the violent intolerance of Palestinians is often justified in the West by claiming that they are the ones who are violently intolerant. Do you see what I mean? There's like this strange irony there that people who are the victims of the most aggressive violence are themselves portrayed as being the source of violence and intolerance. And that seems to manifest quite significantly both around queer communities. This idea of Israel is the safest place for gay people in the region, but also around, the protection of Christians, that in the Muslim world, Christians are so severely persecuted, as if Muslims in the Western world have not been.
Yeah, I was going to point to the same examples, I feel like, around pinkwashing and around the narratives you hear when you see queer people, including myself, speaking up for the rights of Palestinians. You will often online, etc., get responses from pro-Israel people saying, oh, well, do you know what would happen to you if you went to Palestine? Which feels like, you say, it makes the people who are experiencing violence the supposed perpetrators of violence. And it kind of reminds me of this quote by the feminist academic Sarah Ahmed, who says this thing about, often the people who point out the problem and resist the problem become the problem themselves. They become rhetorically and ideologically framed as the people often perpetuating the very problem that they are trying to resist. And I do think that that's something that is really happening in this context. And I also think is very much informed by certain manifestations of racism as well. But I think also this thing of Christian Zionism feels like a really important example to talk about when we're thinking about the different ways that Zionism can manifest. Because obviously earlier in the program, we've been talking about this kind of conflation between Jewish people and Israel, or Jewish people and Zionism. But actually, I, when doing this research around Christian Zionism, was thinking about the fact that actually Zionism comes in many, many different forms. And actually, it also points out the way that Zionism in itself can intersect with anti-Semitism. As was pointed out in that interview, the belief that kind of Jewish people should go to Israel to bring about a second coming, during which they will be condemned to hell, is in many ways anti-Semitic. It's kind of instrumentalizing Jewish people for Christian eschatology. And so I think that that's a really important thing to think about in this story as well. And also can kind of be linked to, for example, Arthur Balfour, who made kind of similar arguments that Jewish people should go to a homeland outside of kind of majority Christian societies because he believed that they couldn't assimilate. And so, yeah, I really kind of think that we should think very critically about these conflations between Judaism and Zionism, because we see that Zionism comes in all different forms, from Christians, atheists, from governments. It comes from many different places in society.